You want to open up to Kings? We're going to keep our Old Testament book overview rolling tonight. I've got 3 things of introduction to say about Kings before we actually look at the message of the book. And then we'll dive into the message, which I think is a really good one, that something we should probably pay attention to. I mean, obviously it's the Bible, but it's a really good one tonight from this message. First of all, I think it's important to see this. In the Hebrew Bible, there is the book of Samuel and the book of Kings. And it wasn't until the Septuagint, which happens around the time of Jesus, where the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, that Samuel becomes 2 books that we call 1st and 2nd Samuel, and Kings becomes 2 books that we call 1st and 2nd Kings. This on the board behind me right now, this is the table of contents. It's an electronic version of the Septuagint that I have, but it's still the table of contents for the Septuagint. And it might be interesting for you to look at this and to see what 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are in the Septuagint. You've got Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st Kingdoms, 2nd Kingdoms, 3rd Kingdoms, and 4th Kingdoms. And so when we say 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, I don't know what you're thinking of in your head about these books, but it kind of, especially when you call them the different things, it kind of makes it sound like maybe they're about different things. But the Septuagint treatment, this would have been the Bible that Jesus and his apostles, what they quoted from, what they read from, they referred to it as 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kingdoms, which if I had my preference, which I don't, nor do I suggest that I should in this case, but if I had my preference, I would think 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kingdoms is probably a better approach to these 4 books in our Old Testament. So long as you do one thing, you're going to be okay. It's just one big story. That's what you got to know. That's the thing that you got to have in your head. It starts in the days of the judges and moves through Samuel, who is rejected, and then Saul is appointed, and then you have David and Saul together, and then 2nd Samuel is David, and then 1st Kings starts immediately where 2nd Samuel left off and just carries the story on all the way to the end. And so I don't really care what you call the books of the Bible. Probably we ought to just call them what our Bibles say. But the moral of the story is that this really is one continuous story. I put the story up here, like the whole thing. The story really starts in Genesis. I mean, if you will think about it, from Genesis, the rest of the Bible isn't going to be like this. And we're going to come to a point where we're going to have to start taking books and plugging them back into their context. But up to this point, we've just been reading through the books of the Bible, and it's been one story, pretty much one linear story from Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy. I threw some dates on here just so you can get a sense of what kind of a time span we're looking at with these books. If you want to try and imagine a timeline, the Law of Moses, we sometimes would say, this is what I say, the Law of Moses was given in 1440 BC, so that's a nice, you're thinking of Exodus, like Exodus 20, really through Numbers. I don't remember the chapter in Numbers. That's Israel at Sinai getting the law of Moses. That's 1440. Saul becomes king in 1050. David becomes king in 1010. And then 1st and 2nd Kings are divided into 3 main sections. And I think that this is what, Sandy, this is what you guys are doing, and Jonna, this is what you're doing with your class material. I think these three sections would be helpful. You have the time period of Solomon, which is United Kingdom still. Then you have the divided kingdom that spans 1 Kings 12 all the way into 2 Kings 17, and then 2 Kings 18 to 25 will be Judah alone. And Judah was finally destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And so I put the dates up there really just to do something like this. You know, this is always interesting to me. I've got 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. I'm looking at about 500 years here. And that's a pretty big number that doesn't really mean a whole lot to me. But you look at this chunk of text, and what you're doing is you're basically saying 2 of our country. If you think about it like that. I mean, what have we been a country for 245 years? Imagine what's happened in 245 years in the history of our country. Imagine everything that's changed and everything that's different. Now imagine where we will be in another 245 years. The way I say it is, imagine if we will be in another 245 years. But imagine that at the rate of change, you know, imagine what that looks like. And that's what we're looking at here with 1st and 2nd Kings. And so that, I think, is helpful to notice. And so, number 1, we talk about, you know, just how Samuel and Kings go together. Number 2, we talk about dates and the structure. This is the structure that I want you to see. As you're looking at 1st and 2nd Kings, it's divided into 3 points, but I want you to really pay attention to Samuel too, because it's one big story. One last thing that I want to talk about here is just the author. Technically, Kings is unanimous. We don't know who wrote it. I don't have any idea who wrote it, but I put up here for Samuel, we read 1 Chronicles 29 verses 29 through 30 the last time that we did one of these, which I think was 2 weeks ago, 2 Sunday nights ago. And 1 Chronicles 29 verses 29 through 30 points, I think, to the books of Samuel, but Chronicles says about it that it is the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, Nathan the prophet, and Gad the seer. And so, obviously, I don't know if you've ever just thought about this or not, but if you haven't, you need to. Obviously, 1st and 2nd Samuel is not all about Samuel, and it's not even all written by Samuel. The first part is by Samuel, but Samuel dies in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So obviously, if he records his death, it's not written by him. And so this is important. This is going to really lead us into what we're doing tonight, because I'm kind of in dark water here. I don't like to come to this place whenever I'm teaching, but I'm in a kind of maybe place where I don't know the answers to the questions that I'm saying, to the things that I'm saying, and you need to know that. You need to know that what I'm about to say is not, anything that I can prove. But based upon what I've showed with Samuel and how Samuel appears to be a compilation of work that various prophets in various times and various situations seem to have written, and somebody at some point in time took the work of Samuel and Nathan and Gad and what they wrote and put it together into what we call 1st and 2nd Samuel. Or this could be another way that it happened, and I don't know what this was like, but maybe Samuel wrote, and Samuel said, okay, Nathan, you're next. You're the prophet. Here's what I've got. And Nathan just kept the story going, and Nathan wrote, and then Nathan said, okay, I'm done with what I'm going to do. Gad, you're next. You write. I don't know how this happened, but the point is that Samuel, at least, seems to be compiled by the prophets, Samuel, Nathan, and Gad. And there's no real indication in Kings, like we have with the 1 Chronicles 29, of who put Kings together. But in Kings, at the end of 1 Kings, this is where you're going to see Elijah. And so Elijah, one of the really big prophets, one of the biggest prophets in the Bible, is operating and working during this time. He's in Kings. There's a huge chunk of text, if you will look at the things that like chapter 17 all the way to the end of 1 Kings, mostly has some stuff to do with Elijah and Elijah's work. And so it's not out of the realm of thinking that maybe Elijah had a role in this. It's about him. There's a huge chunk, a bigger chunk than anything else about Elijah. Maybe Elijah was the one who was doing it. And then in 2 Kings, look at that giant chunk of text in 2 Kings. 2 Kings 2 through 8 is almost exclusively stories about Elisha and what Elisha did. It's not really very hard to imagine that Elisha had some role in 1st and 2nd Kings. Look at 2 Kings 19. We won't read it, but I want to just show you a couple things about this. In 2 Kings chapter 19, and the heading above chapter 19 is Isaiah reassures Hezekiah. And so Isaiah has a, he's in the story. He has a pretty big role in the story. Do me a favor. Turn over to 2 Kings 18:1. I need you to open up your Bible and read in 2 Kings 18:1. And I'm not going to read 18, 19, and 20. You're welcome. But I'll just start here to kind of make a point. You're reading in 2 Kings 18:1. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them, and the king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem with a great army. And he stood by the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. And there came out to him Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household of Shebna, the secretary of Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder. I could do that 18, 19, and 20, but here's the thing. I was reading from Isaiah 36 just now, which 2 Kings 18, 19, and 20 is identical text to Isaiah 36, 37, and 38, I think, something like that. It's not really out of the realm of possibility to think that Isaiah had a role in at least 2 Kings, since there are 3 chapters in 2 Kings that are in Isaiah. That is some of the stuff that Isaiah wrote. And there's one more thing that I would show you. There's a lot of these neat little Easter eggs with prophets all throughout this, but here's one that's really cool. Look at Proverbs 25. If you just want to kind of think about, what it would have been like in the days of these prophets as they're thinking about this history and writing this history. In Proverbs 25, if I asked you who wrote the book of Proverbs, I bet most of you would say Solomon. At least most of Proverbs are the wise sayings of Solomon. But in Proverbs 25 and verse 1, it says, "These also are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied." And so, yes, they are the Proverbs of Solomon, but it was during the time of Hezekiah that his men, Isaiah was one of those men, one of the prophets of Hezekiah, that his men were out there collecting these things and writing these things and putting these things together into the Bible that we call the Old Testament. They're forming it as an ongoing process. And so 2 Kings has a lot to say about Hezekiah. It's not outside of the world of possibility to think that some of the prophets during the time of Hezekiah had something to do with putting this history together. And I say all of that just to make this one point. That was the third thing. I said we're going to talk about the structure, first, second, third, fourth kingdoms. We're going to talk about the dating and how the books go together. We talked about the authors and how I am of the opinion that it was the prophets. I don't know what prophets, but it was the prophets who were responsible for putting this material together. But that really leads me to what I want to talk about tonight. When you read the prophets, I'm talking about Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Joel, Amos. When you read the prophets and you say, there is a message here that these prophets are saying to God's people. There's something for me to learn about my life and who God is contained in the message of these prophets. And for whatever reason, what we do whenever we read, I shouldn't inflict you with this. This is sometimes what I do, not what you do. I have no idea what you do. When I read 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, I don't read it like prophets. I read it like history. This is what happened. And this is where it happened and all of these kind of things. And so you've got history. In fact, we do that with our Old Testament. We say these are the historical books and these are the prophets. We've got history and we've got prophets. And the prophets give us message about our life and how we're supposed to act. And history tells us what happened. But if 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings were put together by the prophets, it's something that we should consider to call these books prophetic books. And there is a message inside of these books that the prophets are telling us about who we are and how we're supposed to behave. Don't read 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings as historical books about this is what happened. Read these books as prophetic books with a message to us that says not only here's what happened, but this is what prophets are really good for. They say here's why it happened. It will transform the way that you read these books. I think that it should transform the way that you read these books. And so that leads us into what we're going to do tonight. I knew that would happen. The conversion from my PowerPoint to Keynote cut off the whole bottom of my slide, so you'll just have to listen when we get down there. Sorry about that. What we're going to do tonight is ask the question, what is the message? In 1st and 2nd Kings, what are the prophets trying to tell us? And I think, even though there's a couple different things that you could say about this, I think that there is one big message that they show us 3 different times in some of these different people. And the message is this. I'll tell you the message here from the very start. And I hope that you will appreciate why this is really important for us to know. When the leaders of God's people stop serving God, and even more than that, when the leaders of God's people stop serving God and start serving other gods, destruction always eventually happens. That's the message of this prophetic history. I think you can see it just as clear as the nose on my face. When the leaders of God's people stop serving Him, eventually destruction is the result. And I'll tell you what, that's something that we better be paying really careful attention to. Because that's a message that's just as alive and well for us right now, today, as it was for the prophets and kings. Let me make my case. 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 28. David is on his deathbed. In chapter 1 and verse 28, Solomon becomes king. And you can see just the heading there above chapter 128 in my ESV. The heading says Solomon is anointed king. In chapter 4 in verse 20, I think that if I were you, I would mark 1 Kings chapter 4 and verses 20 and 21. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. That verse there, 21, Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms, and it lists the borders. This is the one and only time in all of Israel's history that they possessed all of the promised land. Remember when God said, starting back in Genesis chapter 15 with Abraham, I'm going to give you all of this land from the Euphrates, and then a couple different times he explains it, and he says all the way to the river of Egypt, and he tells them that. And the people didn't get to go in because they rebelled, and then Joshua took them in, and they had to fight for it, and Judges, they were fighting for it, but they had their own special problems in what to do, and then Saul fought and got some of the land, and David fought and got some of the land. But here in the time of Solomon, in this verse, in verse 21, this is the one and only time that Israel was Israel as it should be. All of that is just to say this at the top left of this chart right now. Life is good. Everything is the way right now that it's all supposed to be. In 1 Kings chapter 6, the heading is that Solomon builds the temple. This was God's promise to David. Your son is going to build my house. And so, what is it in verse 1? The end of verse 1, it says, he began to build the house of the Lord. And then at the end of the chapter in verse 38, it says the house was finished. And so, Solomon built the temple. It's all good. Turn over to chapter 10. This is the pattern. There's going to be a three-part pattern that we see in all of these situations. 1 Kings chapter 10, there's a big section that's interrupted by a chapter break. It's 1 Kings 10 and verse 14 all the way down to chapter 11 and verse 8. And what we're reading about here is how Solomon, even though things were good, God said, I'm going to give you everything, man. It doesn't get any better than this. You're living in the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. And this was the one time that it was the land flowing with milk and honey. And it's all good. And they built the temple and they have the house of God and everything's good. And 1 Kings 10:14 through 11:8 is Solomon messing it all up. And I would do this. I would write down this reference and do this later on. We're not going to do it now. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. God said to Israel, when you ask for a king, here are 5 things that you have to know when you ask for a king. Number 1, in Deuteronomy 17:16, he says, don't acquire many horses for yourself. Your strength is not your military. Don't acquire many horses for yourself as if you flexing your muscles is why you are all this. Don't acquire many horses. In the second part of verse 16, God says, and don't you even think about going back to Egypt. I saved you from that place. Do not go back to Egypt and make an alliance with them and get your military might and your horses and your power from Egypt. In Deuteronomy 17 and verse 17, he says, when you ask for a king, he is not to acquire many wives for himself. Don't be like all the other nations. Don't acquire many wives. In the second part of verse 17, it says, don't acquire excessive silver and gold for yourself. Which as you read through 1 Kings chapter 10, in verses 14 through the end of the chapter, it's saying Solomon did gold, he collected gold, he had so much stuff, it was like the silver was like nothing in the days of Solomon. And so God said, don't do this. And you know what I feel like when I read this text, and you compare it to Deuteronomy 17, I almost feel like Solomon went through Deuteronomy 17 and made a list of everything that God said, and then he worked to do the opposite. God said, don't acquire gold for yourself. 1 Kings 10 says he acquired gold for himself. God said, don't acquire many horses. In 10:26, Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. God said, don't go to Egypt. In chapter 10 and verse 27, 28, Solomon's import was from Egypt. God said, don't acquire many wives for yourself. In chapter 11 in verse 1, King Solomon loved many foreign women. And the last thing that God said in Deuteronomy 17 in verses 18 through 20 was, and don't leave me. He said the king is to write out a copy of the law. He is to study the law. He is to walk in my ways. And we will actually read this one starting in chapter 11 and verse 4. When Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after the Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites on the mountains east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifice to their gods. So there's three parts to each of these stories. Number one, Solomon had everything. God gave him everything. Part two, he messed it up. He stopped serving God. And not only did he stop serving God, he started serving other gods. Part three, God took it all away. Or at least the huge majority of it. And you can see that in verse 11. The very end of verse 11 is just one little piece. God says to Solomon, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. So that's the first of three stories. God's leader stopped serving God, and God took it all away. Destruction was the result. Number two is going to be Jeroboam. In 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 26, we're introduced to Jeroboam. This is going to start what we call the divided kingdom, when Israel becomes a thing. Look at verses 37 and 38. This is what God said to Jeroboam. Listen, this is promise to David caliber stuff. What he says to Jeroboam, this is the biggest promise he could possibly make to Jeroboam. He says, I will take you, and you shall reign over all that your soul desires. And you shall be king over Israel. And if you will listen to all that I command you, and will walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you, and I will build you a sure house as I did for David, and I will give Israel to you. So here's Jeroboam, just like Solomon, on top of the world. He has everything, and everything is good. And then in chapter 12 and verses 25 through the end of chapter 12, you have the second piece of the story, which is Jeroboam's sin. And this is where he sets up the golden calves in Dan and Bethel. He makes his own little festival, and he appoints his own little priest, and everything's good. He goes through like Solomon. And I mean, I can't think of any other way that this could have possibly happened. It's like Jeroboam read in the Bible what God said to do. This is what I want you to do. This is what I want you to do. This is what I want you to do. And he wrote it down on a list, and he said, I'm going to do the opposite of every single one of those things. And that's exactly what you read about here with Jeroboam's sin. And so God ends up saying to Jeroboam a couple of different times, but this is the big one, I think. Chapter 13 and verse 34. This thing became sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and destroy it from the face of the earth. In chapter 14 and verse 15, the Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water, and root up Israel out of this good land that he gave to their fathers, and scatter them beyond the Euphrates, because they have made their Asherim, provoking the Lord to anger. He will give Israel up because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned, and made Israel to sin. And next to that, if you would like to write a reference to 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 6, it ultimately happens just as God said it was going to happen. 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 6 says, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria. The three parts. This is, remember I said Kings is divided into three main sections. Solomon. God gave him everything. He sinned. God took it all away. The divided kingdom, Israel. God gave Jeroboam everything. He sinned, and God took it away. The third part is Judah only, the last kingdom of God's people to stand. And I think that this is where you might just consider 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 14. Because God said to David, when your son commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. We might come at Judah only, the place where the son, the descendant of David was king, and we might say to ourselves, surely God won't take it away from Judah. Surely not. This cannot be possible, because he said, I'm not going to take away the kingdom from you. And we're going to jump way deep into this story and not look at the big one, but look at 2 Kings chapter 21. In 2 Kings chapter 21, Manasseh was the straw that broke God's back. Starting in verse 10. The Lord said by his servants, the prophets, because Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these abominations and has done things more evil than all the Amorites did, who were before him, and has made Judah also to sin with his idols. Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am bringing upon Jerusalem and Judah such disaster that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. And I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria. God says, you know that thing that I did to Israel up there? That's what I'm doing to Judah and Jerusalem. Because they've become just like Israel, and even worse in many ways. He says, I'm going to stretch the measuring line out. In verse 13, the plumb line of the house of Ahab. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it, turning it upside down. I will forsake the remnant of my heritage and give them into the hand of their enemies, and they shall become a prey and a spoil to all their enemies, because they have done what is evil in my sight and have provoked me to anger since the day their fathers came out of Egypt, even to this day. And then what you do is you just flip to 2 Kings chapter 25, go to the very last page of 2 Kings. Just go to the end, because this is how the story ends. It's not the whole verse, but 2 Kings 25 and verse 21 says, the king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. And this is the key. So Judah was taken into exile out of its land. It is the identical pattern in the three parts of Kings. Judah had everything. God gave them the world. They stopped serving God, and beyond that, started serving other gods. And even though God was very patient with them, eventually he took it away. Destruction is the end of that road. 3 different times you see it in the 3 main sections of the book of Kings. And so this is where I'm going to end, because I think that there are some other things that you can take away from Kings. And I'm not going to read the passages as we think about this, but some things for us to think about. Just 2 things real quick. Some of the good kings held off the destruction for a little while. And so you have Manasseh, who is the straw that breaks the camel's back, and God says, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm done with you people. I'm going to wipe you off the face of the earth. And then Josiah comes along, and Josiah is a good king, and God says, all right, I'll give you some space. But he says at the end of Josiah's story, but I'm not changing my mind. I think that this is the way that we should consider ourselves in the world right now. We live in a fallen world that has completely turned away from the Lord, and the end is ultimately going to be destruction. So what is our role here and now? I don't know. Maybe we can just hold it off for a little bit. Like Hezekiah and Josiah, by shining some of God's good light in the world around us. So there can be this message about there were some good kings who held it off for a little while. There can be a really cool message. This could be a sermon all by itself about God's mercy. In each of these situations, especially with Judah, God took a really long time to come to the end of his rope. I showed you in the block of 1 Samuel through 2 Kings, a block of 500 years. Anybody here have 500 years worth of patience? I mean, I barely have 5 minutes worth of patience. And God is just patient and patient and patient and patient and patient. And so there's got to be a message in 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings about the grace and the mercy and the patience and the love that God has. I think about 2 Peter 3. If you open up your Bible, keep your finger there, because there's a couple things I want to read. But this is the first. The Lord, in verse 9, the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. Peter specifically says the words to us that God has not come back to destroy the world because he's being patient with us. He's waiting for people to repent. That's the mercy and the grace of God. And so, yes, there's a great message in Kings about how sometimes good people can hold it off just a little bit. Yes, there is a message in Kings about the grace and the mercy and the patience and the love of God. But the ultimate overriding point that just eclipses everything else is what we've already said. And this is my one-sentence summary of Kings. When God's leaders stop serving him and even serve other gods, destruction will always eventually follow. There is no way that walking down that road is going to end in a good place. It's only going to end bad if you stop serving God and start serving other gods. And so 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. And then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and its works that are done on it will be exposed. Our world has abandoned and forsaken God, and maybe he's being patient, and maybe we're holding it off for just a little while, but we know how the story ends. And so what's the point for you? What's the point for me? 1 Peter 3:11, the very next verse. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness? If the problem is not serving God and serving other gods, then the solution is to turn to God and to stop serving other gods. It's so simple. Christianity is difficult, and I feel the struggle. Faith is hard. I feel the struggle every single day. I feel Romans 7 every single day. I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things that I do want to do. Christianity is hard. But the solution to the problems that we see around us in the world every single day, the solution is simple, and it's right in front of our face. Serve God and stop serving other gods. That's the message of Kings. And I think it goes even beyond that into 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, I hope that you will honestly, patiently give some thought to what we've talked about and to say, maybe things aren't going in my life as I would like for them to go. I mean, sin is ultimately at the root of that. I'm not saying that, you got cancer because you sinned and you're suffering the consequence. But sin and turning away from God is the root of all bad things. And you look at your life and you say, I'm not really where I want to be right now. Okay, somewhere down the road of you individually or the world as a whole, turning away from God is the root cause of that. The answer is simple. Just come back to him. And commit to serve God and stop serving other gods. If you know what you need to do and we can help you with it tonight, come forward as together we stand and sing.